Early morning light spilled onto the highway as Officer Megan stood watch near a checkpoint set up by the California Highway Patrol. With her, like every shift, was her loyal partner, Riley, a German shepherd trained to sniff out trouble long before anyone else could see it. Riley sat at her side, barely moving, her body tense and ears perked up. It was as if she felt something off, floating on the wind, something invisible brushing past the usual hum of the road. Megan had been on countless early shifts, but today there was an edge in the air she couldn't quite name. Trucks and cars passed in steady waves, but she watched each one a little more closely than usual. Riley's nose twitched and her gaze locked forward, not chasing distractions, but truly focused, almost reading the road for signs. After what felt like a stretch of stillness, a white truck finally appeared around a distant bend. It rolled forward slowly, its license plates barely legible under thick layers of dried mud. For a moment, Megan wondered if the mess was just laziness or if someone had worked to hide the numbers on purpose. That was enough to raise her alert. Without hesitating, Megan stepped out onto the shoulder, lifted her hand, and motioned for the driver to stop. She did it with calm confidence, the kind that came from years on highways like this. But deep down, her instincts started to buzz, sending a quick shiver up her spine. Riley took a step forward, tail low but rigid, sensing that she might be needed very soon. As the truck rumbled to a halt, Megan couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more here than just another vehicle to check. Maybe it was the driver's hesitant way of slowing down, or how the engine idled just a bit unevenly at the stop. Or maybe it was simply the way the bright morning light seemed too clean for what was about to happen next. For a split second, everything felt frozen, like the world had hit pause, waiting to see what secret or threat might be hiding in plain sight, within things that, for everyone else, looked completely ordinary. As the white truck drew closer, Riley shifted from still to fully alert in an instant. The fur along her back rose a little, her body tense as a wire. Her sharp eyes zeroed right in on the back of the vehicle, barely blinking. The air, which just moments ago carried the early morning, calm and a faint warmth from the sun, suddenly seemed thick with a new kind of energy. One bark, loud and sharp, cut through everything. That quick shout was followed by another, each one ringing out clearer and more urgent than the last. It was Riley's signal, a warning that didn't need translation. She wasn't the type of dog to bark over nothing. The trucks around them slowed, drivers craning their necks to see what was going on. The checkpoint, usually marked by routine and quick exchanges, snapped into a new mood. Megan stepped closer, hand resting at her belt, staying steady but keyed up now that Riley had drawn the line between ordinary and suspicious. Even the other officers nearby picked up on the dog's tension right away, exchanging quick looks, as if to ask, "Did you see how Riley's acting?" The big truck stopped fully, and for a brief moment there was nothing but the noise of the idling engine and Riley's demanding barks. Then slowly, the driver's door creaked open. Out climbed a woman, her hair back in a tight ponytail, her face set in a way that betrayed nothing. There was something too smooth about her movements, too steady as she dropped down from the cab and adjusted her jacket. Megan's gut instinct, shaped by years on the highway, straight up told her that nobody could be that relaxed, not with Riley barking away and several officers standing by ready for anything. The woman, Jessica, according to the name patch on her uniform, kept her calm, even as Riley barked directly at the closed cargo door. She made no sudden moves, only watched Megan with a flat look that didn't show nerves or surprise, as if she wished she could be anywhere else. Megan didn't waste time. "Jessica, I'm going to need you to step aside and open up the back. Please." But before Jessica could answer, Riley barked one more time, loud and unwavering, directed so obviously at that cargo hold that there was no way of pretending nothing was wrong. The ordinary checkpoint had vanished. In its place was a pulsing tension that had every officer ready, all eyes fixed on what secrets might be hiding behind that closed truck door. As the tension grew, Megan's eyes narrowed, studying Jessica. Carefully, all the usual checkpoint routines faded away, replaced by a sharpened focus that came less from formal training and more from a gut feeling honed over years on the highway. The silence between them felt thick, every small gesture and pause amplified. Megan's hand hovered a little closer to her holster, fingers tensing out of habit rather than need. But the energy was unmistakable. Officers nearby sensed the shift, their own body language changing as they gathered just a bit closer, everyone waiting for the next moment to unfold. Jessica reached into her jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, careful not to make any sudden moves under the watchful gaze of Megan and Riley, who were still standing stiff and alert, gaze locked on the truck's rear doors. Finally, she handed over her paperwork, license, insurance, and bill of lading, but something wasn't right. Megan flipped through the pages, looking for details that matched up. That was when she spotted the glaring gaps. There was no actual record of a legitimate delivery. No documentation for what, if anything, was in the truck's bed. Only a vague, hastily written note about empty return, and Jessica's words, when questioned, only added to the oddness. "I dropped my last load upstate," Jessica said, glancing away, "and I'm heading back for a pickup." Her tone was flat, almost bored, as if she'd rehearsed this story and didn't care if it stood up to questioning or not. But Megan's instincts had already kicked in. She thought back to all those late nights in different patrol cars, hearing older officers tell stories about smugglers who worked harder at faking normal than anything else. There was always a sign, maybe nervous hands or a blank face that was a little too calm. Here, Megan caught it in Jessica's steady, rehearsed answers and the way she kept her eyes off the back of the truck. Every red flag in Megan's mind went up. "The truck's supposed to be empty, but she sure looks worried about what's back there," Megan thought. She glanced down at Riley, who didn't have to say anything. The dog's posture told the whole story. Megan nodded to her. "Team, the message clear without a word." Where normal protocol would have been enough, this had become a real investigation now, the kind where instinct, experience, and a sharp eye made all the difference. Megan stood her ground, suppressing the urge to let frustration show as Jessica continued to offer flimsy excuses. When asked to open up the cargo hold, Jessica hesitated, mumbling that the lock sometimes jammed and she'd had trouble with it since the day before. The explanation fell flat, especially since Megan had seen enough trucks to know that drivers who hauled expensive cargo worked hard to keep those locks in top shape. Meanwhile, Riley's barking grew more desperate, echoing with a sharp edge of worry. This wasn't her usual protective bark. This was urgent, as if she was picking up on something behind those doors that no human in the checkpoint could sense. Other officers glanced over, picking up on Riley's agitation and Megan's wary stance. Megan's patience ran thin. She kept her tone even, but made it clear she wouldn't accept any more runaround. "Jessica, I need you to step aside. We have to open the back. Now." Jessica avoided Megan's eyes, shifting from foot to foot before insisting, "It's stuck, I told you. I can try, but it really doesn't budge." At this point, Megan stopped trying to make sense of Jessica's stalling. With one hand, she pressed the radio clipped to her shoulder. "Dispatch, I need backup at checkpoint 4 on I-95. Possible concealed cargo. Stand by." As she waited for a reply, Megan started to walk slowly around the truck, Riley at her side. Her eyes traced the seams of the door, the pattern of dirt and road dust on the truck panels, even the padlock and hinges. She was searching for anything, a scratch, a fresh weld, signs the doors had been opened under odd circumstances. or tampered with since the last inspection. Every little thing seemed to add to a growing certainty in her chest that something was definitely off. The whole checkpoint seemed to hold its breath. Conversations died down, and those not involved drifted further away, aware of the tension. Riley's barking, still wild and sharp, sounded like it was warning them all. It was as if the very air around the truck got heavier. Megan tried to stay focused, her mind bracing for whatever they might be about to uncover. There was a kind of fear in that quiet, the ancient kind that only surfaces when you know you're about to face something that someone worked very hard to hide. Time seemed to stretch as the morning breeze picked up, making the flags on the checkpoint flutter and tossing up little clouds of road dust. Jessica had found a spot on the curb just beyond the truck and sat with her arms folded tight across her chest, staring out past the lanes of traffic as though something in the far distance demanded her attention. For the first time since she'd gotten out of the truck, her confidence seemed to waver a little. She wore the same even expression, but there was a certain stiffness in her jaw and the way her foot tapped slowly against the pavement. Meanwhile, Megan's team had quietly closed in around the truck, forming a loose circle that left enough room for Riley to lead the way. Even the new officers, who'd only worked with Riley for a few months, could feel that this was no ordinary search. Every movement, every breath seemed to be in sync, not just between Megan and Riley, but between all of them. Somewhere in the back of everyone's mind was the knowledge that dogs like Riley rarely made mistakes. The dog's body language, desperate now rather than merely insistent, did not belong to a drill or a false alarm. The cargo hold, still locked and silent, drew every set of eyes. On the outside, it looked totally normal, a little rust by the hinges, scuff marks from days on the highway, and the particular shine of a truck recently washed. Yet the tension had settled so heavily over the scene that the officers felt as if the steel shell itself was hiding a secret that wanted to burst out. Megan exchanged a look with Riley, a wordless check-in that was years in the making. She could feel her heart beating harder, not from nerves, but from a strange type of certainty that cops sometimes get, a sense that the truth is hanging just on the other side of a thin wall. Odd as Jessica tried to act cool, her quiet now said more than any story she'd told. Megan and Riley picked up on every tiny shift, a clenched fist, a small intake of breath, the way Jessica blinked a little faster as backup cars finally arrived with a low, steady rumble. The space around the truck seemed to get smaller, almost squeezing out the possibility of innocence. Beneath the calm, routine surface, something waited, and everyone present felt it. Maybe it was fear, maybe anticipation, but above all, it was the sense that the silence was about to crack wide open. Each minute that ticked by only made the tension build more, as if the air itself was pressing down on everyone at the checkpoint. The backup had brought a few more officers and some necessary tools, and two of them worked steadily but carefully at the stubborn cargo hold lock. The sound of metal scraping and the occasional pop of a crowbar echoed through the early morning, and every so often the officers would glance over at Megan or Riley for any sign of what to expect. Riley kept perfectly still, except for her tail, which now swept the ground in slow, tense arcs. The officers around the truck barely spoke, and the ones who did kept their voices low, as if talking might somehow spoil Riley's focus. Megan stood back with her arms crossed, watching everything with the same alertness she'd shown since the first moment the truck pulled in. Her eyes didn't leave Riley, knowing the dog's instincts might catch something before human senses ever could. Jessica, still sitting nearby, tried her best to act indifferent, but there was something guarded in the set of her shoulders and the way she stiffened each time there was a new wrench or rattle at the door. When they finally broke the lock with a snap, the heavy doors swung wide. Everyone leaned in, almost holding their breath, expecting, well, maybe not the worst, but at least some kind of payoff for all this tension. Instead, what they saw was just emptiness. The inside of the cargo hold seemed almost shiny in the morning sun, the steel floor swept clean, not a scrap of paper or a piece of packing left behind. For a second, that eerie kind of silence fell, the kind where even the most hardened patrol officer could feel a trace of doubt. A couple of the younger officers shrugged, as if to say maybe all this fuss had just been over nothing after all. But Megan and Riley didn't relax. Megan's brow furrowed, and Riley refused to let her guard down, refusing to move away from the open door. The dog's nose twitched as she sniffed the air, her body language showing less relief than agitation. Megan didn't buy the picture of a perfectly empty truck, not for a second. Sometimes she knew nothing at all was exactly what a person wanted you to see. And as she studied that spotless cargo hold, she couldn't help but feel there was a problem here, one hidden just beyond what careful eyes could spot, and that she and Riley were meant to uncover whatever was underneath that strange, sparkling emptiness. Jessica's eyes flickered with a strange mix of pride and mockery as the cargo doors hung open, revealing only that shiny, too clean emptiness. She sat a little straighter, as if daring Megan and the other agents to find what clearly wasn't out in the open. The hint of a smirk played at the edge of her lips, and her gaze slid from one officer to the next, enjoying, even if only a little, the confusion and frustration dancing across their faces. The message was clear, delivered without a word. Go ahead, look all you want, you won't find it. But Megan wasn't about to walk away so easily. Years of work along highways from Massachusetts down to Florida had taught her that sometimes the story was not written in what you saw, but in what you were supposed to overlook. So Megan paced slowly along the open cargo hold, her eyes tracing each smooth panel, her fingers trailing lightly over the cleaned-down floor and polished metal walls. She noticed how not even a shoe scuff or fingerprint broke the surface, and the sterile shine didn't offer up a single clue. Megan kept replaying each moment since Jessica's arrival, from Riley's sudden bark to that persistent sense of something wrong. Meanwhile, Riley had gone quiet, but the change in her behavior was impossible to ignore. No barking now, just a deep, steady growl that stirred the air around the back of the truck. She stood at attention, hackles slightly raised, and every muscle tensed, eyes locked on a single spot where the sunlight glanced off the metal. Veteran officers on the scene recognized the signal. This was Riley's way of saying the danger hadn't passed, that the real problem was still hidden just out of sight. The silence grew heavier, thick with that awful feeling you get when the answer slips just past your reach. To those who had learned to trust more than what people said, it was obvious. The case wasn't solved, just wrapped in uncertainty. Megan understood that what looked like a clean slate could be the perfect cover for something deeply wrong. She leaned into the doubt, determined not to let Jessica's smug, quiet, and a spotless truck convince her otherwise, especially with Riley's low growl echoing every concern she already had. Something was definitely not right, and the longer Megan stared into that too clean space, the more the gnawing sense of doubt grew, weighing on everyone present. Megan wasn't letting go of this, and the stubborn look on her face said she was ready to turn that truck inside out. Noting every worried glance Jessica tossed her way, Megan ordered the team to start a full search, top to bottom, inside and out, every inch. Officers pulled on gloves and got to work. They slid mirrors under the chassis, tapped along the walls, poked at seams in the metal, and climbed up to run hands along the ceiling. Every latch, panel, and bolt was checked. Some used flashlights to peer into corners. Others pressed along the floor and walls, looking for panels that might sound hollow, or shift if pushed. Through it all, Jessica's attitude began to crack. Where earlier she'd sat tall and stubborn, she was now shifting on the curb, arms wound tighter around her, her foot tapping double time. Her stare didn't challenge Megan anymore. Instead, She kept glancing away, avoiding all eye contact. Her jaw set in a hard line. The mask was slipping enough for the officers nearby to notice her discomfort. Jaws set, eyes narrowed. Even the younger ones, usually quicker to dismiss a gut feeling, were exchanging uneasy looks. Inside the truck, the search dragged on. Riley prowled along the open hold, nose moving methodically, while Megan stayed by the doors, watching both the dog and her team. The emptiness was suspicious in itself, and every second that passed with nothing found just made the whole thing feel more unnatural. At one point, an officer rapped against a spot at the back that sounded just a bit different, but nothing obvious. Turned up. Still, Megan trusted Riley's signals more than any empty hold. With the atmosphere thick and no clear answers, Megan decided to dig deeper into Jessica's background before letting this go. She radioed for a records check, spelling out Jessica's name and driver's license number clearly, her patience thinning as minutes ticked by. She had learned that sometimes the missing piece wasn't hidden in metal or shadows, but in someone's past. If there was the slightest chance that something on Jessica's record, an old charge, an unpaid ticket, even something that just didn't add up, could give her what she was looking for, she was determined to find it. The tension at the scene was almost physical by now. Even the traffic on the nearby highway seemed quieter, as if drivers sensed something unusual was happening. Megan found herself holding her breath, waiting for a sign, from the search, from Riley, or maybe from whatever secrets Jessica was still working so hard to keep. The radio in Megan's hand crackled, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the crew. She pressed it to her ear, focusing on the dispatcher's voice as she relayed the results. The name Jessica Davis came back with a red flag, several notations about past stops for suspicious cargo, none of which had ever led to a proper conviction, but each left a smudge on her record. There were brief investigations, a couple of fines, and paperwork trails leading to storage yards in Atlanta and Miami, some marked unresolved. It was just enough history to make Megan's pulse kick up, sending a wave of cold certainty through her body. She knew right away this was a pattern, not just a fluke or a one-off bad day. The odds of Jessica's truck being completely clean just didn't make any sense. She started connecting dots, her mind racing over the details, the too clean cargo hold, Riley's unrelenting vigilance, the nervous tapping of Jessica's foot. Megan began to see that this wasn't about minor rules or forgotten paperwork. It was something deeper, something someone had gone out of their way to hide. Jessica was no longer just a driver waiting out a routine inspection. Now she looked more like someone hoping a secret wouldn't catch up to her. Jessica sat stiffly, surrounded not only by police officers, but also by the invisible pressure of her own story closing in. Her arms were still crossed, but her eyes darted around, and she hardly seemed aware that Riley was sitting only a few feet away, the dog's gaze pinned to her every movement. Riley had stopped prowling the truck and now sat in silent watch, making Jessica's skin crawl every time their eyes met. Her cool, taunting edge had been replaced by an anxious silence. What could have been a textbook traffic stop was changing by the minute. Every officer present felt it, that turning point where a simple check morphs into something far bigger, and everyone has to decide if they're ready for what they might find. For Megan, the hunch had grown too strong to ignore. This was about more than paperwork or inspection reports. It was about something hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right question, to dig just deep enough. And Megan knew they were almost there, standing at the crossroads between routine and real danger, with Jessica balancing on that razor's edge of being discovered. All at once, the steady hum at the checkpoint broke as the radio came to life. With sharp urgency, Megan barely had time to process Jessica's background before the dispatcher's voice came through, sounding tense and quick. There had just been a report from the state police. Earlier that morning, a cargo truck with a matching plate number had been flagged in connection with a kidnapping. Details flew past, names and addresses swapped rapidly as the dispatcher read out everything she could, but there was no mistaking it. This was no longer just a suspicious stop. The truck sitting in front of them was now linked to something far darker and immediate. The news hit Megan hard. Her heart pounded as she realized just how deep the trouble really went. Up until now, she'd suspected hidden cargo or some petty smuggling, but a kidnapping. That pulled all the pieces together in a way that made her skin prickle. She looked straight at Jessica, who was no longer just nervous, but pale and rigid. Her lips parted as if trying to come up with an excuse that would work in a situation like this. For a moment, nobody moved. Even the nearby officers just stared, absorbing the new reality. Riley barked once, sharp and loud, and the team snapped. Back into action. Megan quickly motioned for backup, her mind racing. Was someone trapped? Was there something or someone hidden even more carefully than they'd realized? She replayed Riley's odd behavior and the too-clean truck, remembering every bit of strangeness that now made more sense. All those warnings. From the past, all the records hinting at shady transports, they didn't just suggest minor crimes, they hinted at someone hiding much bigger risks behind the everyday look of a cross-country truck driver. Megan clung to this thought, realizing they may have just stumbled into the middle of an operation that crossed state lines and broke laws much graver than anything she'd faced in routine highway patrol work. The whole situation shifted. Suddenly, nothing felt routine or safe. She understood there was no turning back from this moment. The mix of old records, the pressure from Riley's instincts, even the tiniest details from the search, all tangled together. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that she and her team weren't just part of an investigation, but were now key players in the beginning of something much larger than any of them had imagined. Whatever happened next, it would leave a mark. None of them would forget. As the confirmation from headquarters seemed just seconds away, Megan couldn't ignore the gravity in the air any longer. She squared her shoulders and walked over to Jessica, whose breathing had grown shallow and who now looked every bit the cornered figure. Megan leaned in, voice low enough that only Jessica could hear, but firm enough to carry authority. She gave her one last shot at cooperation, explaining that the evidence against her was piling up fast. She told Jessica that it was clear something serious was going on, something far past traffic stops or paperwork mistakes, and that coming clean could mean the difference between facing everything alone or getting at least a little understanding from the law. Jessica, though, was determined to hold her story together. She shook her head, her mouth tightening as she repeated the version she had been sticking to since the start. She claimed she had no idea what anyone was talking about, that she was just hauling a shipment out of Houston, and that the truck was clean, because that was how she always operated. Her words rang with a rough sort of dignity, as if she was fighting to keep some small piece of self-respect, even as the walls closed in. The other officers gathered around, watching closely and ready for anything, though the wait seemed to stretch forever. It felt as though the world had hit pause. Cars on the interstate zipped by, but for those at the checkpoint, everything was suspended on this final moment before the news broke. No one wanted to be the first to move or speak. Riley sat a few feet from Jessica, body tensed, brown eyes fixed and unblinking. He seemed to sense what was about to happen, the way only a dog like him could. One twitch, one word, and Riley would be up in a flash, ready to respond to the smallest sign of threat. Everyone knew something major was about to come to the surface. The officers felt the weight of it, the sense that they weren't just about to make an arrest, but that they were about to disrupt something much larger. As Megan waited for the dispatcher to call through with the full confirmation, she watched Jessica's every move and tried to calculate what would happen next. The ones who gambled on secrecy and luck often underestimated both the instincts of a good dog and the persistence of people who refused to look the other way. The dispatcher's voice finally cut through the thick air, almost crackling with finality. Confirmed. The truck is stolen, reported missing out of Dallas last night. The actual owner was held at knife point. All evidence points to an organized ring. The words landed with the weight of a hammer, and there was no more room for doubt or denial. Megan gave a short nod to her team, and in a single trained movement, the officers closed in around Jessica. The circle was tight and purposeful. No chance of slipping away now. Jessica's eyes darted from one officer to the next. For a split second, it seemed she might try to argue one last time, but the sight of so many badges and Riley's steady stare kept her silent. The reality of what she had done hit her fully, only as steel cuffs snapped around her wrists. The earlier confidence and sharp pride in her demeanor fell away, replaced by a blank, shell-shocked resignation as the voices of the officers echoed out, reading her rights and confirming they had her in custody. This was not the escape she had planned on. As Jessica was led away, the hush that had hung between everyone at the scene finally broke up, replaced by the clatter and movement of officers finishing up their work. They started cataloguing the truck once more, this time making sure nothing was missed, scanning for signs of who else might be involved or any clues the ring had left behind. Riley, sensing the tension had passed, finally relaxed. He stopped growling and eased up out of his tense crouch. Megan let out a breath she felt she'd been holding all along, and crouched down to rub Riley behind the ears. She whispered a soft, "Thank you." There was something special about the moment that went beyond just making an arrest. There was a clear understanding between handler and dog. No matter how well someone tried to hide the truth, some things always came to light when instincts and experience were trusted together. More sirens grew on the horizon as Texas State troopers and Dallas detectives arrived to take over, praising Megan and her team for stopping something that could have turned far worse. Megan watched Jessica loaded into a squad car, silent and lost in her own thoughts, and turned back to her crew, the weight of a job well done settling in with the dust of the road behind her. As the dust began to settle on the roadside, an ambulance pulled up alongside the rows of patrol cars and flashing lights. The officers moved with a new sense of purpose, guiding a woman from the back of the van. She was wrapped in an emergency blanket, her hair tangled, her face clearly marked by the ordeal she had survived. Her steps were slow and hesitant, but when her eyes met Jessica's, everyone there felt the gravity of what had really happened. The woman, whose name was Susan Carter, looked at Jessica and nodded with a quiet certainty that erased any trace of doubt. This was the owner of the stolen truck, and she had been through more in the past 12 hours than most could imagine. Megan watched the identification happen with a heavy heart. For her and the rest of her team, the real danger was thrown into sharp focus. It wasn't just about uncovering some clever scheme or catching a criminal in the act. They had all stood a little too close to something truly violent, a crime where a real person had been threatened and left out on the edge of nowhere. The relief at catching Jessica was replaced by an awareness of just how vulnerable everyone had been, and how much worse things might have turned out if luck had tipped the scales another way. Jessica kept silent now. No more stories, no more pretending. She watched as Susan was moved gently into the care of medics, and she didn't even flinch when the officers read over the charges for a second time. The resistance that had propped her up through hours of questioning and bluffing seemed to fade with Susan's quiet, tired presence. Jessica finally accepted the end of her run, shoulders slumped, her hands cuffed, a look on her face that might have been regret or maybe just exhaustion. The area, which had moments before felt tense with questions and suspicion, dropped into a hushed stillness, Nobody spoke for a long beat, not even Riley. The clean, empty cargo hold still lingered in Megan's mind, but she knew that piecing together every last detail could wait. What mattered most was making sure Susan was safe, protected, and listened to. Sometimes, Megan realized, the job was not about catching the perfect crime, but about remembering the reasons to fight for the people left in its wake. After the patrol cars drove off with Jessica in the back seat and the ambulance headed to the hospital with Susan, Megan made her way back to the very spot where all the tension had begun. The Texas morning had given way to sun, and the traffic had picked up, but to Megan it felt like the checkpoint was holding onto the memory of what had happened. Each step she took, the tension from earlier seemed to crack and fall away, piece by piece. Around her, officers spoke in relieved whispers, some shaking their heads at just how close everyone had come to letting something terrible slip past. Others quietly grateful that the worst possibilities had been prevented. Riley padded beside Megan, his tail wagging just slightly, the usual edge to his movements gone. There was a different energy between them now, a kind of relief mingled with exhaustion that only folks who had pulled through the heat of real danger could understand. Every so often, a fellow officer would walk by and give Riley a scratch or a kind word, his role in the morning's events already becoming the stuff that stories would be told about back at the station and maybe even online, where officers often shared small victories to remind themselves why they kept showing up. Word of the operation's success spread fast, from radios to group texts and across the precinct's social feeds. By midday, the image of Megan standing next to Riley under the bright Texas sky, which an officer had snapped on his phone, was already making the rounds, earning comments from co-workers and folks in other departments. Riley's focus and loyalty became a bit of a legend by lunchtime, with jokes about him deserving a steak dinner after his shift. Despite all this, Megan couldn't shake the thought that maybe they were only seeing the tip of something bigger. There were too many unanswered questions about the organized ring, the route the stolen truck had taken, and what else might have been in play behind the scenes. Still, for just this short time, Megan allowed herself to feel a sense of calm. She stood with Riley shoulder to shoulder under the wide Texas sky, appreciating the rare moment where recognition and respect quietly settled in, not just for the job they had done, but for surviving the invisible dangers that so often went unnoticed in the shadows of the highway. Later that evening, after the rush and heat of the day faded, the squad returned to the station outside Dallas. The mood in the building was lighter than usual, with officers gathering in groups to rehash the events, trade congratulations, and tease Riley with pieces of jerky and bits of cheese from their sandwiches. Someone had even printed out the picture of Megan and Riley, taping it to the breakroom fridge with a cheerful caption about teamwork. The department captain stopped Megan in the hallway to thank her and remind everyone how rare these wins could feel in their line of work. Riley got more than a few extra treats and a special pat from the chief himself, who squatted down on arthritic knees just to look the dog in the eye and mutter that the department needed 10 more just like him. For a few minutes, the worries and tensions of the job melted into laughter and easy chatter. It almost felt like real celebration, even if it was a quiet one tucked away from the wider world. Still, as Megan sat down to finish her reports, she found she couldn't quite let herself relax. Her mind kept returning to the empty cargo hold of Jessica's truck. The spotless, nearly echoing space inside stirred something that felt unfinished, a nagging itch that the bust had not solved everything. She played through every detail again. Maps, cargo logs, Riley's signals, even the brief look in Jessica's eyes right before everything fell apart. The old sense of unease settled in. What if there had been something else in the truck before they stopped it? What if pieces were still out there, waiting for some other, less lucky officer to catch them off guard on a dark stretch of road? Even as she closed out her shift, A digital message popped up from headquarters, full of formal thanks and praise. It felt nice, but it also seemed distant from the reality of the work. When Megan finally stepped outside, she found Riley waiting at her truck. He looked up at her with that knowing stare, the one that always felt like he understood more than he could say. Megan ruffled his fur and felt a quiet understanding build between them. Out there, the road spread in every direction, always promising more questions than answers. She knew true rest was only ever a pause, because wherever long stretches of silence could be found, trouble never stayed far off. Back at home later that night, Megan sat alone in the quiet of her small office. She flipped through digital files and printed sheets spread out across her desk, occasionally stopping to zoom in on a blurry photo or a grainy scan from the day's investigation. Nothing about the images of the truck's empty cargo hold made sense. The shine on the walls was far too clean, almost fresh, the kind of polish you barely saw on a brand new trailer, let alone one from the fleet that spent their days crossing Texas from border to border. Not a single fingerprint, not one scratch, showing regular work, not even a random scuff that you would expect from boxes sliding across the floor. The more she studied the reports, the more it bothered her. Sure, sometimes criminals tried to wipe down a scene, but not this thoroughly. She reread the forensic notes twice, paying special attention to the part about cleaning agents. Under a blacklight, the forensics team found chemical traces that matched the disinfectants used in hospital environments, dangerous stuff that could scrub away nearly every hint of human presence. Even the corners and hinges had been cleaned out, and any trace of what had been inside before was long gone. That detail changed everything Megan thought she knew about the stop. She realized Riley's relentless focus on the truck wasn't just about a missing person or a stolen vehicle. His instincts were always sharpest when there was more to sniff out than a simple smuggling job or a routine heist. The polished, sterile emptiness suggested something had been transported that someone really didn't want anyone else finding out about. Not just illegal, but possibly dangerous on a whole different level. The more Megan traced each step, the more she saw the bigger picture coming together in front of her. It dawned on her that the truck had been used for something more than just moving stolen goods across state lines. Maybe it was a decoy, used to move something hazardous or untraceable that was never meant to be discovered, with Jessica just the latest link in a much longer chain. Whatever had been in that cargo hold was now just a polished memory and a trail of chemicals, erased so neatly that the only thing left was a gut feeling, a certainty that the roads were hiding secrets deeper than anyone had guessed. Driven by the stubborn feeling that the case was far from closed, Megan pored over digital maps of the truck's journey. She retraced every step, cross-checking GPS data with traffic cameras and local reports. That was when she found it. An unexplained stop near Fort Stockton, at an old gas station that hadn't appeared on most newer maps in years. It was the kind of out-of-the-way place often whispered about by troopers and investigators. A spot that came up in files about illegal deals, always named but never quite pinned down. The more Megan read through past reports, the more certain she became that this was no ordinary layover. The hours lined up just right for a quick exchange or a transfer of something highly sensitive. Each clue pointed to the gas station as a hub, a link quietly connecting crimes bigger than just one stolen truck. The operation had every sign of being organized, routes obscured, times optimized, and every move made with such care that nothing was left for chance. The perfection was almost suspicious, the kind that suggested the people behind it all knew exactly how to avoid getting caught. Megan didn't bother with the usual channels that night. There wasn't time for stacks of paperwork or waiting for clearance from the Dallas office. Instead, she packed a go-bag, grabbed Riley from the backyard where he had been sniffing out rabbits under the porch, and headed west on Interstate 20. The wide, empty highway felt tense with possibility, and Riley seemed to pick up on her nerves, sitting up straight in his crate as they sped past sleeping towns and silent fields. When Megan and Riley pulled into the station's cracked lot, the place looked just as forgotten as the reports had described: busted pumps, weeds tall enough to hide a dog, windows patched with plywood. But anyone who spent enough time chasing things that didn't want to be found knew the difference between real neglect and a place being carefully used. Megan and Riley found footprints still fresh in the dust and trash that was too new for a place this old. Further back, Riley sniffed out packaging for coolers and what looked like wrappings from dry ice. The strange smell clung to everything. It hit Megan, then, that whatever was moved through here might have been alive or at least required to be kept cold, and any sense of this being a simple robbery faded away. They were standing at the edge of something much bigger, a chain of crimes hidden in plain sight, and now her and Riley were right in the middle of it. Soon after Megan and Riley finished checking out the gas station, backup arrived. Patrol. Cars rolled into the lot, headlights cutting through the darkness, and a handful of officers and detectives stepped out. With the area now secured, everyone joined in the search, combing over every inch of the abandoned station with flashlights and gloves. The officers carefully checked the storage sheds out back and poked around the dumpsters and brush. Before long, they uncovered some real clues. A handful of used syringes, a couple of empty bottles that once held veterinary sedatives, and several torn boxes with odd stains and little bits of fur stuck inside. It was not much, but it was enough to convince them something big and strange had been happening there. Definitely not just a stolen truck operation anymore. The scene looked like the cleanup after a hasty transfer of live cargo. Probably animals, or worse, something more experimental or illegal. A few officers swapped uneasy looks, clearly thinking of headlines about rare animal smuggling rings or weird underground labs, but frustratingly, nothing clearly identified what exactly had been in the truck or what the next step in the operation might be. Megan leaned against the hood of her patrol car, reviewing everything in her notebook, while Riley paced at her side, still energized by the chaotic smells and new faces on the scene. The more they dug into the operation, the harder it became to separate fact from rumor. This wasn't just a case of missing property anymore. The clean truck and the frantic, near-professional level of sterilization at the station pointed to people with experience, people who most likely would not hesitate to vanish if they sensed law enforcement getting too close. It was unsettling to realize how easily this network blended in, using run-down places and forgotten routes, never leaving too much behind. Megan could tell that every discovery made the situation more complicated, not less. Connecting this spot to other abandoned warehouses and zigzagging back roads felt like chasing shadows. Each new clue only deepened the mess, proving that the game being played was too large for a neat answer. Megan saw now that if she made even one wrong move, or if one piece of evidence went unnoticed, the true masterminds could slip away for good, or someone else could get hurt. The empty cargo hold had just been the surface. What lay beneath was a tangled web that, if left unchecked, could end up costing a whole lot more than stolen property. Megan's restlessness only grew in the days that followed. Every time she filed a report or talked shop with fellow officers in the department break room, new pieces kept falling into place, and none of them made her feel better. She found herself going back over old investigations and comparing case notes, picking out a pattern that was impossible to ignore. There were more trucks than just Jessica's, and more missing cargo than anyone at first realized. In one report after another, drivers gone from their routes for hours, detours that made no sense, and GPS logs showing vehicles that arrived nearly empty when they should have been packed full. Sometimes Megan would look over at Riley, stretched out on her office floor or waiting by the front door at shift change, and see that same alert look in his eyes. Out on the highway, when they'd stop behind slow-moving semis or step out for a coffee at a rest stop, Riley always took an extra moment, sniffing a curb or listening for something Megan could not hear. That steady, knowing calm reminded Megan that all the highway's secrets hadn't surfaced yet, and there was still danger hiding beyond the next bend or parked trailer. As the investigation pulled in more agencies, the scope of what they were facing became clearer. The Texas Department of Public Safety worked with intelligence units and even looped in agents from the Border Patrol, piecing together a map marked with pins and strings that pointed toward one big hub. It turned out, deep out by El Paso, there was an old warehouse that looked barely open but ran night traffic. In and out, rain or shine. It was only when they cross-referenced license plates and truck manifests that they saw most of the suspected vehicles made late-night stops there. Megan and Riley rode with the task force on the night they moved in. They arrived as headlights cut through the dark, parking in a line that grew longer as more units rolled up. Guided by Riley's nose, his snout pressed low, zigzagging for every new scent, they swept through the building and finally saw it. All rows of thermal boxes, some cracked open with vials and pill bottles inside, all labeled with strange markings. Proper officers cuffed men and women who did not try to run, knowing it was over. There was relief catching the main players, but Megan could not help feeling a bit unfinished. They had found the center of the ring and stopped one chain of danger, but the road, she realized, could always demand more answers, more courage, and more watchful nights. With the last suspects on their way to holding, Megan found herself standing next to Riley outside the now secured warehouse, the buzz of radios and shouts of victory slowly fading into the night. The chaos of the bust settled into tired energy as yellow police tape fluttered in the desert breeze. Beyond it, the highway, stretched out long and empty, disappearing into the kind of darkness that seemed to hold all the world's mysteries. Megan let herself breathe for the first time in hours, hands resting on Riley's head as he sat at her side, tail thumping softly against her boot. Colleagues from El Paso shook hands and talked through next steps, congratulating Megan and expressing real respect for Riley, who by now was practically famous among the teams. They all knew victories like this did not come every day. There were stories traded and even some half-joking bets about who could finally get Riley to play fetch instead of sticking right by Megan's side. Laughter and relief drifted through the air, but Megan felt the weight of the moment. She knew that this win, as important as it was, would never be the end of these kinds of jobs. As they watched the line of trucks roll away under escort, Megan couldn't stop thinking about everything she and Riley had seen. She thought about the empty trailers, the cold cargo, and the desperate hope that with one more sting operation, things would finally get safer, or at least clearer. But out on those roads, there was always another truck, another shadow, and another mystery covered by the long hush of Texas highways. She crouched down beside Riley, brushing the fur on his muzzle and smiling as he looked up at her with those steady eyes. No gadget, no digital file, not even the most thorough forensic sweep had gotten them this far. It was Riley's nose and that wordless connection, their teamwork built on trust and instinct, that brought them to the real answers. As a Border Patrol helicopter thundered overhead, Megan felt a quiet kind of pride. In the end, it wasn't just about the arrests or the headlines. It was about knowing there would always be more questions, more silent nights, and that together, she and Riley were ready to meet whatever secrets came next, hidden somewhere down that never-ending stretch of blacktop.